Good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to this webinar, and in today's session, we will examine the assessment and moderation of the Synoptic project in the subject area of performance skills and art and design. Firstly, though, a few introductions to put a face to a voice. My name is Kelly Johnson, and I'm a Provider Development Officer here at NCFE. My background is vocational education, and I have 15 years of experience of working in the FE sector in various roles, including a teacher, a curriculum leader, and a curriculum operations manager. I specialise mainly in the subjects of sport, health and fitness, and I've educated young people from level 1 to foundation degree level, including A-levels. My role here at NCFE is to support centres through the planning, onboarding and further CPD opportunities for the NCFE qualifications, but in particular the VCERT qualifications, with a focus on promoting and advancing learning. I'm also really pleased to tell you that we are also joined today by Graham Lees, who is our lead external quality assurer for arts and music and a chief examiner. Graham has worked at NCFE since 2013, and before this, he lectured in music performance and technology in a large FE college. Would you like to say hello, Graham?
Hi, afternoon all. Hope you can hear me there.
Okay then, so the plan for this webinar is to firstly provide you with a summary of our approach to awarding for this academic session. There will then be an overview of the structure and delivery of the Synoptic project task for performance skills and art and design for this academic session. It will provide information on marking, grading and giving feedback to your learners. It will also detail the internal quality assurance process and the documentation that you can use, including the grading calculator, as well as the resubmission process and submitting your grades to the portal. Lastly, it will provide information on the external quality assurance support that is available to you and your centres, including the documentation and the process for the EQA reviews and the expectations, as well as the certification process. Finally, there will be an opportunity to ask any questions that you may have. Please note that in this webinar, we will be covering the processes for both when it's business as usual and the adaptation for awarding this year. So before I begin and go through the summary for the delivery and assessment of the Synoptic project, I'd first like to do a quick poll on how confident you're currently feeling with the assessment and moderation of the Synoptic project. So please do have a think about this. 1 is little to no confidence and 10 being very confident. So I'm going to launch that poll and it should appear on your screen anytime now. So if you'd just like to put a response in. Okay, we seem to have all the results that we're going to get. So I'm going to close that poll and I'm going to share those results with you. Now, not surprisingly, for the first question, I'd expect people potentially to be at varying stages of confidence, but we do find that our attendees today are in the 1 to 2 bracket. So I do hope that by the end of this webinar, you will travel a journey with us and you're ultimately feeling more knowledgeable and confident about the assessment and moderation of the Synoptic project for performance skills and art and design. Okay, so I'm now going to use this slide to briefly explain our approach to awarding for this session, and we've adapted our assessments so that they can be delivered in line with public health guidelines. We've also updated our assessment variation process to allow centres to use additional test centre locations. All relevant qualification content must still be delivered and assessment criteria met. To further support centres, significant adaptations have been made to the conditions of the VCERT Technical Award Synoptic project. So what have we done? We have adapted the delivery and completion conditions so that it can now be completed by learners remotely where required. We have removed the requirement to complete it within a set number of hours. We've also removed the requirement of completion under control conditions. Furthermore, we've brought forward the release of the Synoptic project brief so that centres can plan their own delivery timescales around their own delivery plan. Last year, it was released on the 1st of November, and learners do need to be registered and booked onto the controlled assessment so that it can be viewed and accessed. We've also removed the timescales around the submission deadlines, but there is a deadline for having the final grades onto the portal, which is the 27th of May 2022. Learners will still be able to have a resubmission opportunity, but this will be managed internally by the centre. Learners should have the opportunity to undertake 2 submissions, so a first submission and a resubmission, but it is the final grade that should only be entered onto the portal. Grades for the learner's first submission do not need to be entered onto the portal, but assessment records should be kept up to date to provide a full audit trail of the resubmission. Finally, the EQA review deadline is to be conducted before the 31st of July 2022, and this is to allow results to be confirmed by the end of July for performance tables. At this point, I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Graham, who's going to talk you through the structure and delivery of the Synoptic project.
Hi, many thanks for that, Kelly. I'm now going to provide you, as Kelly says, with an overview of the structure and delivery of the Synoptic project for both performance skills and art and design. So, looking at the first elements here, we've got some paperwork. I would recommend that you download the necessary paperwork from the NCFE Qual Hub website. The 2 documents you could see, I would recommend that you have copies of these available. The first one of which you can see is the Assessor Feedback to Learner form, and the second one of which is the Declaration of Authenticity. Obviously, both of those are to be used post-assessment or as part of the assessment process for learners. Also available, and you can see the art and design variant there, but there's also one available for performance skills, is the learner log. So the learner must complete this every time they work on the project to track their progress. This will support the learner in achieving AO5 of the assessment, which is managing and evaluating the project. So there's a pro forma there for the learners to work through in terms of that learner log. So if we just look at the performance skills evidence, first of all, the tasks are based on a given theme, which changes session on session. The tasks are largely static with some variations in. The first task in this particular instance is a video presentation in which the learners communicate plans, including performance and pre-production roles in response to the brief. The second task is that the learners should produce a baseline skills assessment and rehearsal plan relative to their own performance planning. The third task is a technical plan, and that would include a stage plan, technical specification, a technical rehearsal plan, and an event itinerary. The fourth piece of evidence is a promotion plan and promotional material that the learners have developed to promote their performance. And the final piece of evidence is in this case, the video of the solo performance. As noted, we have made some adaptations in this session. Normally, for performance skills, there would be 2 performances involved. However, in this session, we only require 1 performance, and that is a solo performance on video. So if we move on and look at what the brief might look like as presented to learners. So you'll see there that the learners presented with a brief, which gives a brief overview of the scenario. The overriding aim of this is to plan and realise a live performance event. And we have a theme, which in this case is celebration. The 2 areas in which we ask learners to consider is their work in a pre-production role, i.e. so within the specification, all the roles that are named in the pre-production roles there to work towards the presentation or event, and in this case as the solo performer. You'll see the evidence list there that we just talked about, including the direction that they must perform as a solo performer, and the performance should be between 2 and 5 minutes in length. If we move on to the art and design Synoptic project, you'll see a similar kind of demand. So again, the tasks are based on a given theme, which changes session on session. The points of evidence or the evidence required for this Synoptic project are an interpretation of the requirements for the brief completed by the learner. For the learner then to go and carry out research as per the theme of the brief, including finding examples of work by artists and designers to inform their judgment. The learners are asked to analyse the use of visual language in the examples they've found and to analyse how research represents the theme, all to feed into their own work, which, following the development of a proposal, they will go on and create. Again, in terms of adaptation, we're looking for one piece of completed learner practical work here. Sorry, sound lost. Sorry, so we're looking for one piece of learner work rather than the two which would normally be required outside of adaptations. If we move on to the art and design brief, we can see here we've got again a scenario. So a local library is looking to launch a campaign for a specific target audience, quite a wide-ranging target audience, and we're looking for the learners to present an exhibition to launch the campaign. So the theme of the exhibition is given, the wonderful world of fiction, with the additional idea that this will be influenced by the expressionist art movement, all of which is obviously included in the course specification. So there's some further detail about the requirements of the brief, so how the work can be influenced and what the intended ideas are in terms of the audience. And then we move on to the evidence as previously outlined. So the idea of creating a proposal to create a response in terms of realizing the creative intentions based on this brief, looking for the learners to cover at least 2 pieces of art and design work in 2 disciplines in their initial response, and then further to refine that into their own work. Okay, so that was a brief overview of the projects there. What I'd like to do now is move on to marking and grading, and over the next few slides I'm going to walk through the marking and grading of the Synoptic project. If we look at the structure of the assessment objectives for the Synoptic project, we can see that we have 5 assessment objectives, or AOs as they're shortened to. So when it comes to assessing the Synoptic project, it should be done holistically. That's the first point, and I think as creative colleagues, creative assessors, we're all very used to looking at that idea of holistic assessment, looking at all the evidence that the learner presents to us to make a grading decision. So holistic assessment. The Synoptic project accounts for 60% of the final grade for the qualification, the other 40 being the external assessment paper. You'll be judging the project as a whole, and it will be assessed against each of these 5 assessment objectives. The 5 assessment objectives are detailed, as you can see there. Each assessment objective, as you will notice, has a different weighting. So the band awarded for each AO will inform the overall grade award for the Synoptic project with those weightings in mind. You can see here that the weighting for the first band is 10% for both performance skills and art and design. And this is the idea of knowledge recall. We'll come to how these relate to the evidence momentarily. You'll see that there's a variant in AO2. In art and design, the weighting is slightly heavier. It's 25% V15. And in terms of analysis of knowledge, the performance skills weighting is slightly higher. In terms of practical for both, though, there's a slight difference. Performance skills is weighted slightly higher at 45 V40, but the key point to make here is that the practical outcome, be that the performance or the art and design product, is the most heavily weighted part of this assessment. Okay, so once you've entered the grade for each of the AO elements, the resulting grade will be the one that's entered onto the portal. A point to make here is that we'll show you how to calculate the final grade later in the presentation with some examples, but also marking assessment of the Synoptic project can only take place when the learner has submitted the completed project. So it's important here to note that marking can only take place on summative assessment. So moving on to look at the assessment in more detail. This is a performance skills example. Descriptors have been written for each assessment objectives, and you as assessors will use the grading descriptors to determine the banding decision for each assessment objective. So for each of the 5 assessment objectives, AO1 through 5, we then have a banded assessment, and we've got 4 bands in each. You'll see the lowest band is not yet achieved, so there's no rewardable material, and then we have bands 1, 2, and 3. Each band contains subject-specific grade descriptors, so you must review the project and determine which band is most fitting to the level and standard of work produced by the individual learner. Keywords are highlighted in bold to support you to make your assessment decisions. The example presented on the slide that you can see details the grading bands for AO1 performance skills, recall knowledge, and show understanding. When making your decision, consider how well the learners have achieved the band from the evidence presented. Have they correctly used specialist terminology? Is this accurately applied throughout the project? Have they appropriately applied this knowledge to the project? So when considering awarding in a band with multiple statements, as we can see here, there's 2 statements in each band, best fit should be applied in regard to the level of the learner evidence. As an extreme example, a learner may be able to recall and communicate a comprehensive knowledge, which would put them in band 3, but subject-specific terminology is basic and inconsistent, so I would put them in band 1. Now, it would be unusual to find a learner with such a level of kind of differentiation, but not impossible. So there we've got to apply the rule of best fit. They're clearly not fitting into either band 1 or band 3 fully. So in this instance, it would be appropriate to make a holistic decision and award in band 2. So again, an illustration here of how we can make holistic decisions and how we can use the banding there. So just moving on to look at some examples of best practice. When making your assessment decision, you must ensure that the assessment decision is clearly identified and the band awarded is recorded for each of the assessment objectives. So it's very important that you award NYA 1, 2, or 3 for each of the 5 AOs. You must indicate and record what evidence has been attributed to this particular grade. Make it clear which of the AOs have not been achieved equally. So if we've got any NYAs in there, we must state that as well. And that formal written feedback on the documents that we saw earlier, if you like, is provided to the learner. You don't have to use the NCFE documents necessarily, but we have provided them for you, and they are completely functional documents. If you have a document that works for you or your centre, you may use that. From the QA reviews that took place last year, I've listed examples of best practice that the EQA team have identified, which you might find useful when marking and assessing the completed Synoptic projects in this session. So there should be a consistent approach taken to the grading of each assessment objective. So you need to apply the logic of the banded grading and find the band of best fit for the learner. You should grade each learner as an individual, taking a holistic view of the whole completed project and all of the evidence presented. You should remember to authenticate the project to confirm that it's the learner's own work. And via your feedback, encourage the learner to self-reflect and evaluate their own work. A number of centres last year used different coloured highlighters to identify on learners' work where evidence met a specific assessment objective, which is fine. It helps yourself to track the evidence. So it provided a clear visual image of where the evidence was located, and a useful audit trail for yourself. This may or may not be applicable across the range of evidence. Obviously, that's useful for written evidence and printed evidence. Digital evidence, not necessarily so much, but you may find a similar system to implement for that. So again, we've got no issues with how you choose to track the evidence, but ultimately it should lead to an assessment decision and feedback. So what I'd like to do now is look at an example of an assessed piece of work from a previous session from art and design. So this is the first evidence that the learner presented, and if you recall, what we were asking for here is an interpretation of the requirements of the brief. So you'll see here that the learners produced a written statement in terms of interpretation. They've taken the brief that was given at this stage and they've annotated it effectively. So the learner has identified the key themes from the brief, and you can see that they've pointed to those key themes there: the idea of the local airport, the Italian futurism that have been highlighted. Annotations provide evidence of the learner's thought process there through the commentary. So that would relate to AO1, recall knowledge and show understanding. Now, for our purposes, this has been marked into band 2 of AO1 in terms of the learner grade given. If we move on to the next piece of evidence, thank you. This is the proposal which is distilled from that interpretation. So the design proposal here is satisfactory with content that is reasonably accurate and reasonably detailed, including a contextual factor that may influence the creation of the work. So the learner has taken that brief and taken their analysis of the brief and produced this short but relatively effective proposal. The proposal relates to the theme and the research, so it's not removed from the brief, and it identifies work in 2 disciplines as required. Also looks at materials. It considers that research might be undertaken, but that's a little bit limited. Moving on to the next piece of work that the learner presented for this, so similar ideas really. This was in regard to AO3, which would be analysis and evaluation of knowledge and understanding. So the learner here has appropriately analysed and evaluated their research, including examples of the works of others. The selected examples are all appropriate and relevant to the theme and the brief, and they do demonstrate purposeful research. So in this case, this evidence fed into the award of band 2 for AO3. So that's the level we might expect to see there in terms of research. Moving on to the next little bit, we're looking at the learner's evidence of development. So a thing to note here in this example, this is an example from a previous session when the adaptations weren't in place. Just to restate, in this session, the adaptation is in place, so the learner selects one final piece from their proposal, but usually 2 pieces would be expected. This work relates to AO4, which is demonstrate and apply technical skills and processes. In this work, the learner has demonstrated and applied technical skills and processes in realising intentions with a sufficient degree of creativity and aesthetic quality. The portfolio provides evidence of appropriate application of technical skills and ability, including successful use of and application of visual language, materials, media techniques and equipment. This evidence eventually was assessed as band 2 for AO4. So we can see a pattern developing in terms of the grading for this learner. Looking at the next piece of evidence, which is obviously a picture of the final piece. We've just looked at one final piece here with regard to our adaptations for this session. So this is relating to AO2, applying knowledge and understanding. So in this case, the learner has skillfully applied knowledge and understanding in an appropriate and relevant way. The interpretation of the brief and initial ideas are appropriate, and the initial ideas have been developed and refined, demonstrating relevant and skillful command of visual language. Experimentation and testing of materials and techniques, as well as a selection of final materials, media and techniques, are appropriate in communicating the intention of a successful outcome. So the final design shown here is appropriate and relevant to meeting the brief, and you can hopefully see the futurist elements and the aircraft element in there and how that's been used to contextualize the learner's response. Once again, that was placed in band 2 overall. If we then go and look at what the learner log might look like, you can see here an example of the learner log using the format supplied by NCFE. I should say again, we supply the document. If the learner would prefer to log their ongoing work in a different format, that's fine, but I would draw the learner's attention to the detail requirements within the log. In this case, the learner does provide an ongoing commentary and timeline, and it does show planning and the development process. Also contained within the learner log, and using evidence from the learner log, we can see the evaluation element. If we move on to the next slide. Super, thank you. So here's an evaluation that's based on all of the learner's evidence, but can be drawn from the learner log fairly heavily. So the learner has managed the project, and you can see the learner's commentary in there in relation to that. Including preparation and planning of the project stages, timeframes and resources in a reasonably effective way. Some of the learner's written work within the log is reflective, which would demonstrate a retrospective approach to recording the planning and would potentially limit achievement for this assessment objective because the learner hasn't really used the log in a particularly useful way. They've gone back and backfilled the log, which obviously is not quite as effective as an ongoing log which reflects and develops and feeds into an ongoing cycle. However, the learner has evaluated most of their approaches, skills and accomplishments in a reasonably detailed way. So again, for the evaluation, the learner was placed in band 2 for AO5. So we can see the learner's been consistently graded. This is what the learner's overall grading looked like. So based on the evidence, the learner is operating in bands, in band 2 for all of the AOs. This is part of the grading calculator that you're asked to fill in, because this decodes the band marks into a percentage based mark that we saw earlier on. So it basically uses the weightings to calculate an overall grade. You can see in this case, based on the 2s in each of these AOs, the learner has come out with a level 2 merit. Okay. So again, just to restate this, it's important to consider all of the available evidence against each band to make a holistic and fair judgment for each learner. So although the evidence we just looked at there was fairly clear-cut in terms of which band the evidence would point to, that may not always be the case. If evidence exists in a different part of the evidence than we were expecting, it is completely fine to mark that in holistically and keep a reference as to where that is. All right. So let's have a look at a performance skills example now. Super. Looking at the first element of this is the presentation that we required. Again, this is obviously an example from a previous session. The theme given was power rather than celebration. If you recall from our earlier commentary, the first task is similarly an interpretation of the brief given as a presentation. Now, the learner here has given the presentation as a spoken within a spoken video, and the text here is shown. There's no requirement for the presentation to be to a live audience, so the presentation could be pre-recorded, could be a recording or verbal presentation, or written as video. So there's lots of ways to present the evidence. Again, the intention here is to look at the learner's skills of presentation with regard to the qualification specification, and not punish them for using a very narrow band of evidence. So this learner has produced concise commentary relating to the three specific areas. The example can provide can apply assessment against AO1 and AO3 within the mark scheme. It's worth noting that assessment should be holistic across the breadth of the learner evidence rather than confined to individual tasks, just as art and design. So credit the evidence against AOs where appropriate. In this case, AO1, learners recall and communicate appropriate knowledge and understanding of performance and production principles, and the subject-specific terminology rather is used accurately on occasion. A few examples where it's not quite so specific. For AO3, the learners appropriately analyse and evaluate performance requirements, judging and reaching suitable conclusions. And you can see here the learner has distilled those ideas down into this presentation. The video is as per the text shown here. It's worth noting that very often learners might add things in their verbal presentation that go beyond their scripting. So again, if the evidence is in the video but doesn't exist in a written form, then clearly the video evidence should be assessed with any additions in there. Okay, so looking at the next task the learners were required to undertake. In this skills assessment, the learners gone some way to analysing their skills and graded them accordingly. So you can see that the learners used a matrix of skills and rated themselves within that. It's not completely clear though if the second column represents ongoing development or targets for the learner. So the purpose of this particular table-based assessment isn't entirely clear. We can hypothesize what might be going on there, but the skills do certainly relate to the development of the project, but there's little detail in terms of technical performance skills. You'll see there's far more kind of soft skills involved there rather than more detailed commentary on specific performance related skills. This can be usefully developed to consider skills required for the performance in the role of a dancer and choreographer to feed into the development of the rehearsals. So the evidence could feed into AO1 and AO2 here. In the case of AO1, the learner recalls and communicates basic knowledge and understanding of performance and production principles, but subject-specific terminology is a little bit basic and inconsistent. There's no real detail in the performance skills element of the skills. All right? And this was presented as a text-based exercise. Again, learners could feasibly expand on that with verbal commentary or other forms of commentary. Should they be comfortable with that? Moving on to the next bit of evidence. We asked for a rehearsal plan. So in this rehearsal plan, the learner has broadly outlined sections of the piece to develop along with dates, dates against those developments. The learner references equipment, although this is quite limited in terms of specifics. You'll see that the equipment's really just coming down to a phone for the start of the rehearsals there. The learner does not, though, consider specific performance techniques to be applied. So the focus is on sectionalizing the piece, which is fine, but is quite unspecific. Aside from this written evidence, notably, the learner provided short video clips and verbal conclusions drawn from the rehearsals, which allowed for much greater evidence against AO2 in terms of application of knowledge and AO4 in terms of demonstrating application of equipment, material and techniques. So the video evidence very, very much supported and expanded on the written evidence that we can see here. Notably, the learner makes no reference to the identified pre-production choreography role, which somewhat limits the assessment of skills and developments in this respect. As a standalone written piece here, the evidence lacks some detail, but combined with the video evidence provided some useful accessible work. So again, a useful illustration of how learners might expand upon written work with video. Moving on, we can see an excerpt from the technical plan here. This performance was undertaken during lockdown. So in this session, the learner undertook the performance at home, making use of available equipment. And I think this approach was to be applauded. The diagram shows basic placement and indicates equipment. You can see that the learner essentially planned the performance on their own or their parents' patio. You can see that they made use of Alexa as to play back their track. Some garden lights to provide a bit of and some garden lights and some fairy lights to provide a bit of ambience to the staging. The staging layout is shown. Okay, it's a basic staging layout, but it's in place. Identifies position of sound and lights. There are limited reference to technical specifications. It would have been useful for the learner to have expanded this commentary to consider the available resources and demonstrate some critical thought given to this approach. So although the resources were limited, the learner could have talked about that and explained their choices in terms of using the equipment available to them. This could have been written alongside a technical specification as required by the task to allow for assessment of the learner's intentions and perhaps discuss the limitations of the available technical and staging resources also. So moving on to promotional evidence, we can see we've got a few things here. The learners developed a timeline for promotion, including a variety of channels for release, which are identified there. The learner has not produced evidence to indicate critical thought given to the mediums or the target audience. So although we've got channels which can be used to promote, there isn't really thought given to how those channels might be used in more detail. The learner has produced a script and an audio clip for a radio advertisement and a promotional poster. The script is well thought out and infers a target audience as well as linking to social media. So again, there's some evidence to be considered there. The promotional poster gives some details of the performance, although it does not reference the venue or any way of accessing the performance. The social media advert references a live stream, but that's not necessarily carried through into specifics. The learner has produced appropriate materials, but has not contextualized them in the context of the performance. The materials and formats show a clear thought, but this evidence could have been developed substantially by a promotional plan, which more clearly outlined the learner's ideas and development of materials. Okay, So moving on, looking at the learner log, as the art and design project, we've got a written logbook here, including summative evaluative comments, and it does show some self-reflection and ideas for development. So the learner evaluated their project via the logbook. The learners produced this evidence to feed into the assessment of AO5 here. The evaluation shown is summative, does lack ongoing commentary in relation to development, but the learners identify some key points and structures the evaluation well in terms of issues encountered, including things which went well and areas for development and time management. Typically, AO5 would also be graded to include ongoing evaluation. In isolation, this evidence would be best considered as AO5 Band 1, so quite a limited evaluation. Learners manage the project, including preparation and planning of a limited range of product stages, timeframes, and resources in this example. So it's more limited evaluatively. The learner provides comments on some of their approaches, skills, and accomplishments. So overall, based on the evidence we have here, the learner is going to be operating in bands 1 and 2 for AOs 1, 2, 3, and 5. Additional video evidence of practical activities, the performance and the commentary from the learner would also feed into your grading. We don't have access to play the learner performance video back here, but it is, as you would expect, a performance in a back garden, although well carried off. It is important to consider all available evidence against each band to make a holistic and fair judgment for each learner. And based on that, again, looking at the numbers that we fed into our grading calculator, we've come out with 2, 2, 1, 2, 1. So the evaluation and AO3 were somewhat weaker than the initial interpretation and the performance itself. So you can see here, in this case, a mixture of 1s and 2s, which would give us a level 2 pass overall as the outcome for this learner. Have we got any questions on that at this point?
No questions have come through yet, Graham, but I don't mind giving it a few moments just to see if there are any that come through, and then I will go through giving feedback to your learners.
Super, thank you, Kelly.
I can't see any questions coming through, but please do feel free to pop any questions that you do have into the question box, which is on your GoToWebinar panel. We will keep an eye on those and pause at timely points to address those questions. So what I'd like to do now then is I would like to talk you briefly through some general guidance when giving feedback and the documentation that is available to support you. Graham will then pop back on to talk you through some more specific guidance on giving feedback to your learners and provide some good practice examples. So here is an example document for the assessor to give feedback to the learner. The feedback can be given to the learners after the EQA visit has occurred, when it is business as usual. The feedback can't be overly specific and directed, so it might be best to use the grading descriptors to assist with the feedback that you give to your learners. So for example, you might say something like, you have described X, but you need to explain the importance of X. Or you have used some key terminology, but you need to use the key terms more consistently throughout your work. There is another option available, which is better suited to the Synoptic project, and this is contained within the grading calculator. On the third sheet of the grading calculator, which is named Learners, are the 5 assessment objectives and the bandings. You could copy and paste this into a different spreadsheet if you wish, or Word document, and use it for giving feedback to your learners. You could circle the relevant banding they've achieved and write your comments for each assessment objective. Again, as Graham has suggested, these are our only suggestions, but they are available for you to use if you wish. So I'm just going to pop back to Graham briefly to provide you with some more specific guidance and feedback on making it more effective.
Sorry, I do apologise, sound issue there. So on this slide, we'll highlight good practice examples that you can use to provide effective feedback to your learners. Remember that feedback should be provided to learners after the project has been sampled by the IQA, in line with adaptations for this session. The IQA, sorry, your internal quality assurance, to double state that. So feedback records must be maintained for review. Your EQA, your external quality assurer from NCFE, will ask to see feedback records as part of the EQA review. Although obviously that's just an aside, because you need to maintain those records for the learners primarily. Effective feedback is developmental and constructive, providing the learner with an overview of how they have performed. A good framework to use is to identify what went well and what the learner could do to make the project even better if. Or identify where learners can add more detailed examples to strengthen their response. I should place a caveat on that to say that you shouldn't be giving very specific examples of how the learner might build their response. So if you find yourself asking the learners to do a specific task to change their grade, then your feedback is likely too detailed. Effective feedback should be evidence-based. You should pick out points from the learner response to highlight key areas of strength. As has previously been mentioned, a good starting point is to use band descriptors to scaffold your feedback. This strengthens the audit trail of assessment and starts to create a rationale for the band and grade awarded. And what I mean by that is to look at the language used within each of the bands and be able to place that in your feedback to reinforce your grading. So you can always also include, or you should also include, probing questions to extend learner responses. So do remember, and Kelly will talk about this momentarily, we have got a resubmission opportunity here. So questions can be used, again, within the realms of not providing specific examples to move the learner along, but questions to allow the learners to consider their evidence and use the assessment objectives and the brief to create further evidence. For the resubmission, you should maintain records of resubmissions, and the EQA will want to see this. Under normal circumstances, and I'm sure we'll mention this again in a moment, the EQA would look at both the first submission and the resubmission. However, as part of the adaptations in this session, the EQA will only be looking at the resubmission. So you should ensure that there is formative and summative feedback for both the first submission and the resubmission in place and documented. Moving back over to Kelly to talk about internal quality assurance for a moment.
Thanks, Graham. So now I'd like to talk you through the quality assurance process, starting first with the internal quality assurance. I'm also going to include some of the things that you should consider when you complete the internal quality assurance process that will help make it easier and more effective. The internal quality assurance stage is the final check of the Synoptic project within the centre. The internal quality assurer should be able to correctly assess and moderate the work, so therefore the IQA need to be knowledgeable on the content, competent on the grading system so they can challenge grading decisions, and not have been involved with the teaching of the learners. If it is your first year of delivery, then we do recommend the IQA sample to be 50% of the learner cohort. The sample should contain a wide range of learners, grades, assessors, and satellite centres if applicable. After the first year of sampling, this can be reduced. And while there is no specific number on the size of the sample, it should still be large enough to give the IQA a picture of the work that has been completed by the learner, so we would recommend between a 20% and 40% sample. Grades can then be given to the learners after this IQA has been completed, but you should inform them that this may change based on the EQA's review. When it is business as usual, no feedback is to be given to the learners at this stage, and feedback should be directed to the assessor. Those grades would need to be submitted usually to us by the 31st of March each year. Your EQA would then sample the work and the assessment decision would either be agreed and banked or rejected. Then your external quality assurer or EQA will discuss their findings, give you a supportive action plan, and once that's actioned, the new grades would then be banked for those learners. Following the EQA review, you could then give your learners feedback and they would be entitled to one resubmission. Now, learners would usually use the same Synoptic project and they would have another 21 hours in supervised sessions. The work would then be assessed again and internally quality assured. And then the resubmission grade will be to be with us by the 31st of May each year. Now, just to know that this is the process when it is business as usual, but as we have been discussing throughout this presentation, there are adaptations in place for this session, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in the presentation when I talk through the resubmission process for this session. To determine the grade achieved for the Synoptic project, we have referred to the grading calculator, and you can use this, and it is contained on QualHub. On the grading calculator, there is a place to put the learners' exam grades so that you can determine their estimated overall grade for the technical award. If you don't know their exact UMS, but you think you know what grade they may obtain based on mock exams, then you can place that in the provisional grade column. If they've sat their actual external assessment, then you can put their actual UMS score into the actual exam grade column. If you use the provisional exam grade column, then the calculator will give you the maximum and minimum estimated grades that the learners could get. If you've used their actual external assessment grade, then it will calculate their estimated actual overall grade for the level 1-2 technical award. You can also place the band achieved against each assessment objective. This will then calculate, as Graham has already shown you, the grade achieved for the Synoptic project. So using the example on this slide, you can see that with learner A, the bands they achieved were a 2, 2, 2, 1 and a 2, giving them an overall grade of a level 1 distinction. Whereas learner B got 2s for every assessment objective and they got a level 2 merit overall. And do remember that this is based obviously on the different weightings for the different qualifications. This is the only assessment objective that learner B did better on, but they jumped up 2 grades. And this just shows how important assessment objective 4 is in relation to its weighting. Also on QualHub in policies and documents, you'll find course file documents. Now your EQA may recommend that you create a course file to contain all the relevant documentation and evidence that you'll need when they conduct their review or come to visit. The documents and guidance on this page will show you what kind of things that you could include in a course file. Please note though that this is for guidance only. It isn't mandatory that you include everything that's on here. You may also wish to adapt the documents to fit within your centre's own way of working. This is just really intended to demonstrate what basic documents could be included in a course file and what our EQAs will look for to ensure that you have appropriate arrangements in place to deliver and assess our qualifications. It may be that you do have other documents depending on the internal processes in your centre and the qualifications you're delivering. Also within the course file documents is the internal quality assurance or IQA documentation, and this includes a sampling plan template and the IQA feedback to assessor example that we have shown you a few times throughout this presentation. So I'd now just like to go through a few of the internal quality assurance considerations that I do hope will help you with this process. So the first thing to consider is that the internal quality assurer is your critical friend, as their role is to support and offer advice and guidance to the assessor. Feedback that is provided by the IQA, as I've said, is to be directed to the assessor and not the learner. It's important that you have an IQA sampling plan and strategy which outlines the IQA activities that you will and are completing over the 21-22 session. I would also recommend that as part of the IQA sampling plan, you sample the full grade profile to ensure consistency of the assessment decisions across the cohort. So for example, if you have learners that have achieved level 2 pass, level 2 merit and level 2 distinction grades, then your selection in your sample should include all those grades that have been achieved. Also, when the IQA is giving feedback, you should consider what went well again, and even better if. And the IQA feedback should think about, do you agree with the grade that has been awarded? Also, do you think that the assessment decisions are accurate? And is the feedback developmental, constructive, and does it confirm the learner's achievement? Also consider that are there any areas of good practice that should be recognised and shared with the rest of the team. So as mentioned on the previous slide, I'm now going to talk you through the resubmission process for this session and then explain some examples of good practice for this process. So as I've explained at the start of the webinar, there are adaptations in place this year, and whilst IQA must still be undertaken in line with our approach to awarding and assessment, the adaptations confirm that resubmissions should be managed internally within the centre, and assessment and IQA records should be kept up to date to provide a full audit trail of the resubmission. The resubmission grades are not to be entered onto the portal. Once learners have been given their feedback, they are permitted to one resubmission of their Synoptic project. In this academic session, the learners are still to use the same Synoptic project, so they don't have to start from scratch, and they can add or make changes to their previous work, but they are permitted unlimited hours to complete their resubmission. The learner can also use the feedback that they are given to make improvements. Once the learners have completed their work, and it should then be marked again, an internal quality assurance check would again be carried out, and then it is this resubmission or final grade that is entered onto the portal. Also, as a footnote, please don't forget to arrange your EQA review, because those slots are filling up fairly quickly. So in summary, the resubmission process for this year is that learners are to complete the Synoptic project, and we have removed the requirement to complete it within a set number of hours. When the learners have completed the project, the assessor will mark it against the grading descriptors and fill in the grading calculator. The IQA will check the learner work and provide feedback to the assessor. Learners are then to be given their feedback and are permitted to a resubmission opportunity if applicable, but this is to be managed internally by the centre. Grades for a learner's first submission do not need to be entered onto the portal, but assessment records should be kept up to date. And the final resubmission grades are to be submitted to the portal by the 27th of May 2022. And the EQA review deadline must be conducted or carried out before the 31st of July 2022. Again, the EQA will then check the learner work and either agree the grading decision and bank the grade or reject the grading decisions. So on this slide, I just want to go through some useful and helpful tips. So the first thing really is making sure to maintain a tracker and your assessment records to evidence the first and final submission. Ensure that you complete the assessment and IQA cycle again. The IQA is to provide feedback to the assessor on the assessment practices and confirm if they agree with the new grade awarded. If they do not, you'll need to decide what grade should be and enter that onto the portal. Ensure that you maintain written IQA logs to evidence the decisions made and the discussions that have been carried out. So next, I'd like to just talk you through submitting your grades to the portal, and then Graham will provide some best practice tips. You can submit unit grades by selecting grading and then submit unit grades from the portal menu. You can search for your learners to submit unit grades using batch, forename, surname, centre learner reference, or the NCFE learner number. Click to select the learners that you would like to submit grades for. Please note though that unit grades should only be submitted once the work has been assessed and a sample has been. Select the learners that you would like to submit the grades for and select Next. When you select a unit, you get the option to select a grade for each learner. When you have finished selecting the grades, tick the declaration and complete the full name of your internal quality assurer before selecting Submit. Confirmation of successful unit grade submission will show. Please note that it is useful to know that it's recommended to save or print a copy of this screen for your records. If you do require any further support, do refer to our portal support user guide, or you can contact our customer support team who are more than happy to help, and they can be contacted at customersupport@ncfe.org.uk or via the phone on 0191 239 8000. I don't know whether it's worth, oh, there we go. I don't know if it's worth, Graham, at this point, if you've had a chance to look at the question box, we do have a couple of questions that have come through that may be worth addressing at this point.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thank you for your questions. We'll just have a quick look at these questions here. Okay, so thanks for your background there, Elizabeth. So you're dealing with the course over 2 years. You have a number of higher retainers. Are there any distinction exemplars you can access? For the Synoptic project, no. At the moment, there are no published exemplars for performance skills. There are exemplars for art and design. So unfortunately, no, there are no distinction exemplars for performance skills that you can currently access. Do we show evidence of formative written feedback during the process? No, we won't be looking for evidence of formative written feedback. We'll, as external quality assurers, we're only interested in your summative feedback. However, that's not to say that providing formative feedback in line with the code of conduct and regulations for this assessment is not useful for learners. So no, we won't as external quality assurers be looking at evidence of formative written feedback. You used to BTEC and have different rules regarding ongoing assessment. Generally, the framework that the majority of awarding organisations work to is very similar. I'm not sure what different rules you might be thinking of there, Elizabeth. I'm quite happy to explore that if you would like to sort of type another question in, or happy to explore after this session if that's easier. But essentially, in terms of assessment, our feedback rules are very much in line as BTEC Pearson are with our regulators. So we need to be aware of that. Super. So Elizabeth, so you're the only teacher of the course within the school. Who do I propose to do the IQA? So the IQA doesn't necessarily have to be a subject expert. It would be extremely helpful if they were. But if you have someone who A, has some internal quality assurance experience, and B, has related subject area knowledge that you can use as a platform for development. So I don't know what discipline you're teaching this in, Elizabeth, but let's say, for example, you were delivering this as a primarily a music qualification. Perhaps one of your drama colleagues might be useful in undertaking the IQA, or vice versa. So if you have any other practitioners, I'll just come back to that. So your discipline is music. So if you have a drama colleague handy, or a dance colleague handy, I would suggest that they would potentially be the best people to use as IQAs, assuming IQA experience as well. If they haven't got IQA experience, there are ongoing NCFE IQA development sessions, which can be found via the Qual Hub website, which may be useful for them to book onto. Super. Yeah. So you know a dramatist is brilliant. So yeah, obviously, Elizabeth, if you've got a suitable person in place, you know, do have a chat and make sure that they've got sufficient time to undertake that role, which is obviously the responsibility of your SLT within the Senate to ensure that sufficient time is in place. We can't overstate the role of the IQA, the importance of the role of the IQA. Here, it's a very, very important role.
Graham, is it possible just to also mention that on Qual Hub, when you actually go to the specific qualification page, we do have the facility to find a centre, and if you put the postcode in of your own centre, it brings up the closest centres. So it's also a possibility that you could make contact with centres that are the closest to you and potentially do centre-to-centre IQA as another option. Also a great opportunity to network, maybe share resources, ideas.
Very much so, yeah, and potentially if the centre have undertaken Synoptic projects previously, they would also have examples of learner work there. In terms of the formative assessment thing there, Elizabeth, so in terms of this project as an assessment, you're quite right. The formative assessment shouldn't be taking place. What we should be seeing is potentially two submissions of summative assessment. In terms of activities in teaching and learning building up to this project prior to the assessment being launched, obviously any SAS there would be subject to formative assessment, and we're not interested in those. So I hope that clarifies. Super. I hope that answers all of your questions, Elizabeth. I'm aware that I've been talking at you for some time there. Cool. Okay. Let's move on. So let's look at EQA reviews. So I'd like to talk to you now, talk through EQA reviews and the support that as an organisation we have available. The final stage of the assessment is the external quality assurance review. So on Qual Hub, in the Delivery and Learner Support tab, we do have a section regarding the EQA reviews. Super. Regarding the EQA reviews, which you may want to view to help prepare you. If you've already registered your learners, then you will have been assigned your external quality assurer. I would say if you haven't registered your learners at this point, please do so. You're entitled to 2 free reviews or visits. So the reviews can be face-to-face or they can be remote, according to circumstance and your preference. And it's worth contacting your EQA now so that you can start to arrange these visits, as many of the EQAs will start booking in appointments already. As you might imagine, there's a very busy period as we come towards the end of the year. So in order to get your the most convenient booking for yourself, I would suggest making an early booking and discussion with your EQA. So some of the key things that the EQA will be checking. Firstly, your internal quality assurance process, as we've talked about in a little bit of detail there. A sample of portfolios to check your assessment decisions. So just the same way that your IQA will be sampling your portfolios, we will look at the submitted grades that come from via the portal, as Kelly's just outlined, and make a decision on who we'd like to see and sample. We may also check your schemes of work and other planning. We'll also include wider aspects such as your policies and procedures in relation to your centre and the course. CPD records and also staff CVs. In terms of the Synoptic project, though, the IQA process and assessment decisions will be the most important. That's our primary focus in terms of external quality assurance. So you'll need to have all the learner work available for the EQA to check. They will either agree your assessment decisions and the grades submitted will be banked, or we will reject your grades. This can be from grading too harshly as well as too leniently. Before we do that, the EQA will have a discussion with you and give you some actions via a very supportive action plan, and then new grades will be banked for those learners. I should point out here that if one learner grade, for example, is incorrectly assessed, it wouldn't mean that necessarily all of the learner grades would be rejected. We do sample in such a way as to drill down into the sample and find out exactly what the issue might be to best inform you and best provide a quality assurance service. If grades are changed by the EQA, this does not affect your learner's capacity to resubmit. So if we advise, for example, that you've marked too harshly and your pass level learners are now merit level learners, that doesn't mean that the learners can't resubmit. It would mean that, as outlined previously, that feedback was given to the learners and an IQA took place again, and then the learners would have chance to resubmit as previously. So after the EQA, feedback can be given to your learners. As we intimated earlier, for this academics year, so 21-22, the EQA will only be looking at first submission in this session as per the qualification adaptations in place. So please do contact your EQA to discuss any adaptations that you're not completely sure about. Communicate with your EQA and advise of which learners have submitted resubmissions and detail any special considerations or support provided. A supportive review, remembering that we've got 2 free reviews here per cohort. A supportive review of first submissions may be possible. Again, discuss this with your EQA. Typically, I would suggest that if a supportive review were to take place, that would be upon first submission of learner work to discuss your first layer of summative feedback, which I suspect will probably be of most use for most centres. So the EQA review this year will take place when you submitted your final grades. Final grades are to be submitted via the NCFE portal no later than the 27th of May, please. The sample can only be sent when final grades are submitted via the portal, and the sample will be sent. Do apologise, slight technical issue. And the sample request will be sent to you before the review. The EQA review will sample a cross-section of the grades achieved by your learners, as Kelly mentioned earlier, potentially all the way from level 1 pass up to a level 2 distinction. Your EQA is there to support you throughout the year, so if you have any queries, please don't hesitate to contact your EQA. You can discuss and plan the timing of a review, which is to be completed, as we've said, by the 31st of July 22. So do please, apologies, do please consider your internal deadlines and an assessment of IQA for the projects with these timelines in mind. Plan your EQA review around your assessment and IQA dates. You can complete the EQA review when you've completed the project. And this may well be before the submission of date of the 27th of May. So if you have built into your submissions to come in prior to the 27th, please do follow that timeline and book your EQA accordingly. So a bit of best practice guidance here. So first thing I would suggest is to download the EQA report from the previous session. Just to remind yourself, you can download that from the portal. Just to recap, you should have received, or you will have received, a copy of the, again, apologies, a copy of the previous report from your EQA. But if for some reason you can't access that, you can access it via the portal. You can search for a visit report by selecting search and then visit reports. You can view all of your centre's visit reports by selecting all in the visit type. Alternatively, you can refine your search by selecting a visit type from the list available or by entering a specific product code, product name, session and/or visit date. You can also find your EQA contact details by clicking on the EQA name, and you can then view your visit report by selecting the relevant PDF. So, having downloaded the report, please do review it. Were there any we set any actions or provided with any recommendations that will support your delivery? Section 9 of the report will detail any actions or recommendations set in sections 3, 4, 5 and 6 of the report. Do remember that actions are mandatory, so if they haven't been acted upon at this point, please do look at the provided dates for those and make sure that you're following the targets set. Recommendations are, as suggested, recommendations and suggestions to take into consideration, so they are optional, although generally most people would benefit from undertaking them, obviously. Okay, after the EQA review has taken place, you'll receive an EQA report which will formally document the outcome of the review. The report is uploaded to the portal within 5 working days of the completion of the review. As the report comes through, please do read the report and make note of any next steps. So particularly to consider the following: will the grades be banked or rejected? Do you have to follow the process to resubmit grades as agreed with the EQA? And do share the report with your team, so your IQA and exams officer potentially, and any other interested parties. Moving on from that, as mentioned previously, when reading the report, consider if you've got any actions to be put in place for the next cohort. Has the EQA given any recommendations to support the development of assessment and IQA practices? So with all that in mind, I will now hand you back to Kelly for certification.
Thanks, Graham. So lastly, I'm going to talk you through what I think is the best bit, certifying your learners and how you can claim your learner certificates on the portal. So now that the Synoptic project has been completed by your learners, they will be eagerly waiting for their certificates. And certificates can be claimed when they have taken and achieved a grade for the external assessment, and they have a banked grade for their Synoptic project. For 2021-22, the EQA review deadline, as we've said, is the 31st of July 2022, and this again is to allow for results to be confirmed by the end of July for performance tables. Please do also again refer to the portal user guide, as it does contain details on how to submit grades, viewing results and certification. But I'm going to talk about claiming your certificates in a bit more detail on the next slide. At this point, I do need to apologise for the technical issues we are experiencing. There seems to be a delay in the transition of the slides, but in the interest of time, I will continue. So how do you then claim your learner certificates? You can make a certificate claim for your learners by selecting certification from the portal menu and clicking the Make a Claim option. Alternatively, you can also select the Claim My Certificate options from the portal homepage. You will then be taken to the results search page. Here you can search for your learners by batch number, product code, product name, forename, surname, or their date of birth. If you require further options, then you can select Advanced, and the options to search on Centre Learner Number, NCFE Learner Number, ULN, etc. will then become available, and you can search on one or more of these options. Your search results will then show. You then select the learners that you would like to claim certificates for and click Submit. When claiming certificates for the VCERT qualifications, your selected learners will then show. Your learners will be displayed then with a new claim status, and this is automatically calculated and will show as full or partial depending on which units have had grades banked for them. The grade is the overall grade if the learner has achieved enough units for a full certificate. If you select a learner, you can see the grades for each unit that have been banked. If you don't wish to claim for a learner at this time, you can remove them from the claim by selecting the Remove Learner from the claim icon. You must confirm the address that you would like the certificate sending to and then select Claim. It's just useful to note here as well that if you would like a purchase order number to show on your any certification orders, that you can complete this here as well. You can then review your claim before it's finalised, and it is worth checking at this point that you have claimed all the units the learner has achieved and the expected status is showing correctly. You can view the claimed units by selecting the learner units, and if you need to make any amendments, select Return to Claim before proceeding. Otherwise, if all is well, you can select Claim Certificates to submit your claim. So we have now reached the end of the webinar. I'd just like to do another quick poll. Now we've actually reached the end of the webinar, just to see how confident you're feeling now with the assessment and moderation of the Synoptic project, I guess both for when it's business as usual and for the adaptations that are in place for this academic session. So as with the first poll, 1 will be not a little confidence and 10 being very confident. So I'll launch that second poll and it should appear on your screen. So if you'd just like to take a moment to think about where your confidence levels. Okay, I think we've got all the votes that we're going to get. So I'm just going to share those results with you. And as you can see, I am delighted to say that, if you remember from the first poll, our attendees was in the 1 to 2 bracket, but now we have certainly travelled a journey today and we are now feeling a 7 to 8. That said, if you are still feeling, obviously there's a big jump in your confidence levels, and I'm really pleased that you're feeling more assured and confident about the assessment and moderation of the Synoptic project for performance skills and art and design. But you know, there are still obviously some room to increase that confidence. So would urge you to contact your EQA. So we have now reached the end of the webinar. I haven't seen any more questions coming through, just really nice comments saying thank you for hosting and your support. You're very welcome, Elizabeth. And at this point, I would like to take the opportunity to also thank Graham. He's been an absolute superstar, and I think it's been really helpful to have that external quality assurer input, especially when it comes to helping answer those questions. If, like me, you do have any further questions once you have had a chance to digest the information that we've given in today's session, then please feel free to contact me directly using my email, kellyjohnson@ncfe.org.uk. And if I am unavailable, our general email is provider.development@ncfe.org.uk. And lastly, do remember, please do contact your EQA, and remember that your learners do need to be registered to have an EQA allocated to your centre. So please do utilise that subject specialist support. And lastly, I've just included some useful links on here for you to refer to if you require any further information and support. And these links include our approach to awarding an assessment for this academic year, the adaptation blueprint, and the quality assurance process. I'm very aware that we have gone over quite some time. So if there are any other questions, then otherwise you can please do feel free to leave the webinar. If not, we're more than happy to stay on for a little bit longer to answer any questions that come through. But if you are ready to now leave the webinar, we'd really appreciate it if you could complete the short evaluation, and this will pop up as you leave the webinar, and this will help us make any future improvements and/or changes to the service and support we provide. At this point, I would just like to say thank you for listening, thank you for attending, and on behalf of everyone here at NCFE, we wish you a continued safe and successful year.